Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. There's even a brand new Brigadier General tier where you can get a shout out on a Commander's Quarters episode that's dedicated to you. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So I have been known to build some, let's just say, off-the-wall decks, like, my 99 lands deck, which many of you out there seem to really enjoy. Well, the Mad Lad is, of course, back at it again with today's episode, where we have, slightly less lands, alright? 99 lands is pretty much the most lands that you can fit into a commander deck, at least to my knowledge. But still, I promise that even though we're missing out on those 2 lands, it is well worth it for the 2 cards that we're going to be putting in there, and yeah, this deck is off the wall and just a bit out there to say the least. In fact, this deck is so unique that according to EDH Rec, which is not a perfect source but the best source that we have, there are exactly 0 decks out there that do what this deck does. So now with all of that said, let's jump into it. So the idea for this deck started when I was thinking about a deck built around a Cascade commander like the First Sliver. Really quick, the First Sliver is a 7/7 sliver that costs Wooburg, so 1 of each color. It has Cascade, and it has sliver spells you cast have Cascade. Now, the vast majority, pretty much every single First Sliver deck out there, is a deck built around that second part, sliver spells you cast have Cascade, and it's a sliver tribal deck where you get an absurd amount of value from just casting your slivers, and you get more slivers off the top, then you cascade further and further and further. And I guess I should say, for those of you that don't know what Cascade is, it says when you cast a spell, exile cards from the top of your library into exile a non-land card that costs less. You may cast it without paying its mana cost, put the exiled cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. Now with this commander though, I pretty much again don't care about that second part that says sliver spells you cast have Cascade. What I wanted to focus on is having a commander that guarantees a Cascade and can give me access to the cards that I want. So with this being a 5-color commander, obviously this fits the bill and gives me access to every single card that I need access to. And actually, here in a bit, I'll give you an example of another commander that I really wanted to work with a deck like this, but unfortunately, well, it's not quite there because it doesn't have access to a certain color. Regardless, again, the goal of this deck is literally, hey, just get 1 mana of each color, cast this commander, and see what happens. Now with 97 lands in our deck, we are definitely never missing a land drop, and we should be able to fix our mana properly so that by the time turn 5 comes around, we can cast the First Sliver consistently. And actually a turn 4 with this commander is possible as well, but we'll talk about that here in a bit. Regardless, say that we get our lands out and that we actually cast our commander, and then we start cascading. What do we want to cascade into? Well, with the way that this deck is built, you might have guessed it, but we are guaranteed to hit exactly 1 card. Because, of course, in this deck, we only have 1 non-land card that costs less than our commander, so it's the only thing that we can cascade into. And that card, of course, is the Golden Pig of this deck, which is the number 1 card out of our 99, and the Golden Pig for this deck is Tybalt's Trickery. Tybalt's Trickery is an instant for 1 in a red, and it's a very unique card with a lot of text, so here we go. Counter target spell. Choose 1, 2, or 3 at random. Its controller mills that many cards and exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card with a different name than that spell. They may cast that card without paying its mana cost, then they put the exile cards on the bottom of their library in a random order. Okay, so there's a lot going on with this card and with its interaction with the First Sliver, so let's break it down. When we cast the First Sliver, that Cascade is a triggered ability that happens when we cast it. So the First Sliver is not on the battlefield yet, it is still on the stack. And the Cascade trigger is actually going to resolve before the First Sliver does. So with it still being on the stack, we are going to actually counter our own commander with Tybalt's Trickery. Now, this is where things get really fun, and with a deck like this, things can definitely not go well how you exactly planned, but yeah, you know what you're kind of getting into with this kind of a deck anyways. Because then we're going to choose 1, 2, or 3 at random, and then we're going to mill that many cards. And as you might have guessed it, since there are 97 lands in this deck, there are 2 cards that this deck is built around, with this being one of them, so we're really hoping to not mill that other card. Now, the percentage chance that we actually hit that card with that mill is going to be incredibly low, but it definitely can happen. Regardless, let's just say again that we end up milling 1, 2, or 3 lands, which is exactly what's probably going to happen most of the time. Then what happens? Well, then we start exiling cards from the top of our library until we exile a non-land card with a different name than the first sliver, which obviously in a game like Commander, we can't even have the first sliver in the deck anyways, and obviously that would just be pretty weird to, build a deck around the first sliver that we Tybalt's Trickery into another first sliver. That makes no sense. Regardless, then we can cast that card without paying its mana cost, and then we put the exiled cards on the bottom of our library in a random order. Essentially, the first sliver cascading into Tybalt's Trickery allows us to counter the first sliver, then reveal cards off the top of our library until we hit the only other non-land card in our deck, and then we get to cast it. Now, of course, you can pick essentially any card in Magic that has a converted mana cost of 5 or greater that you are going to be basically guaranteed to cast whenever you do this. But obviously, there are some top choices out there that can help you win the game pretty quickly when you cast them really early. And of course, the first one that came to my mind was none other than Blightsteel Colossus. Now, really quick, and I should have mentioned this earlier, this deck obviously can be built in a couple of different ways. It can still be very budget. Blightsteel Colossus does not have to be the pick, and I'll go through another example because, yeah, Blightsteel Colossus is like over $41, so this thing is quite expensive. Even if the rest of the deck is very cheap, it still brings that price up quite a bit. And actually, and I probably should have also mentioned this earlier, that the rest of this deck, outside of the Commander's price as well, is incredibly budget-friendly. That being said, yeah, if you've got the money for it, Blightsteel Colossus is a fantastic pick, an 11/11 Golem that costs 12 mana, that has Trample, Infect, and Indestructible. So this thing is really hard to deal with, can trample through for some damage, and of course has Infect, so it can take out opponents on one hit. So yeah, your opponents might be a bit surprised when you cast the first sliver, and then they don't see slivers just popping up, they just see Tybalt's Trickery, which counters your commander, and then just turns into a Blightsteel Colossus casting for free. So yeah, unexpected, spicy, off the wall, and in fact, what's not to love? Now, of course, I should mention that obviously just casting Blightsteel Colossus is not a guaranteed win, even if you do it as early as, say, turn 4 or 5. An opponent could just have, 1 white mana up in Path to Exile it, and then your entire game plan is over, and you know what? That's the risk that you kind of make with these kinds of decks. So yes, Blightsteel Colossus is not a guaranteed win, though it is a very effective one in a lot of situations. Now, that being said, you can actually have one more card in this deck, because with the combination of the first sliver, Tybalt's Trickery, and Blightsteel Colossus, you meet a certain requirement. Or at least I should say, by having just those cards and then 97 lands, you meet that requirement. And that requirement is actually the companion requirement for Giganta the Wellspring. It's a 5/5 elemental elk that costs 4 and Gruul, and it says no card in your starting deck has more than one of the same mana symbol in its mana cost. Again, the first sliver has Wooburg as its cost, so 1 of each color, not a duplicate of any of the colors. Tybalt's Trickery is just 1 in a red, so just a red, and then Blightsteel Colossus obviously doesn't have any mana symbols in it, so there you go. Or, okay, I guess what I mean, only a generic mana symbol that is just 12, and yes, that's not a duplicate, so we're good. And Giganta can actually be a very good companion for the first sliver, being able to tap for white, blue, black, green, red, or in other words, Wooburg, but this mana can't be spent to pay generic mana cost, which is fine, because it can help us cast our commander. So even if we don't have our mana fixing for the first sliver, we can actually just get Giganta out, which can help us fix our mana for it. So again, if you build your deck in this way, definitely consider Giganta because it's basically just a free 101st card for this deck and there's no real reason not to play it. That being said, there are different directions that this deck can take, and if you replace Blightsteel Colossus with, say, something else that might not meet this requirement, well, Giganta obviously can't be your companion then, which is okay. So let's go through some other examples of cards that you might want to consider as your finisher. So for one of my examples I'm going to bring up, I am taking a page out of Alex's book, and I'm going to talk about Eternal Dominion. It's a sorcery for 7, blue, 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 and it says, search target opponent's library for an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land card, put that card into play under your control, then that player shuffles their library, and it has Epic. So for the rest of the game, you can't play spells. At the beginning of each of your upkeeps, copy the spell except for its epic ability. You may choose a new target for the copy. Basically, we Tybalt's Trickery into this, and then we just keep casting this over and over again for the rest of the game. We can't cast anything else, and you know what? That's completely fine. Because we can just go pick whatever opponent we think has the best stuff in their deck and go get whatever artifact, creature, enchantment, or land we want. And yeah, maybe one of our opponents has a Blightsteel Colossus in their deck, and we say thank you for that. Now it's in play under my control, so this has the potential to do the exact same thing as our Blightsteel Colossus build, but even better because we basically get that Blightsteel Colossus, and then we just still keep casting this to get more and more amazing things. In a way, this is kind of like my Cody deck, so yeah, I might lean toward this build, especially since Eternal Dominion is much more budget-friendly than Blightsteel Colossus. Regardless, another option might be yet another epic spell with Endless Swarm. It's a sorcery for 5 green, and it says put a 1/1 green snake creature token into play for each card in your hand, and of course it has epic. Again, with a deck that has 97 lands, you are just going to be playing 1 land per turn, and you are basically guaranteed to have a full grip, so yeah, you're going to be getting 7 snakes into play every single turn with this. So that might be a direction to take it as well. And actually, your safest build for this kind of a deck might be to include a couple of finishers, like, you know, this Endless Swarm, Eternal Dominion, Blightsteel Colossus, etc., 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 just to make sure that, well, you don't mill them with Tybalt's Trickery, or you don't have them in your opening hand or when you have your first couple of draws, that basically you can Tybalt's Trickery into something. You might not be guaranteed of the exact thing that you hit, but it's going to be a bit safer. But again, with this kind of a deck, it's kind of all in anyways, so pick whatever you want. And speaking of that, I do want to bring up one other potential card for this deck that, well, is a bit risky, but pretty funny. So instead of Tybalt's Trickery, you actually could use Madcap Experiment in combination with Blightsteel Colossus. It's a sorcery for 3 and a red, and it says, reveal cards on the top of your library until you reveal an artifact card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Madcap Experiment deals damage to you equal to the number of cards revealed this way. So basically, hey, go get your Blightsteel Colossus off the top of your library and put it into play, but for every single card that you revealed while getting to your Blightsteel Colossus, you're going to be taking damage. So just even casting this card could just take you out of the game, and yeah, that sounds like fun. Now, of course, you could include other giant artifacts in your deck to try to mitigate this, but what's the fun in that? Now, speaking of other options, before going through the rest of the actual deck, I do want to bring up one other commander that, again, I was trying to make work in a way like this, but just, it's not quite there. And that commander is a Moti Celebrant of Bounty, a 3/1 Naga Druid with Cascade that costs 3 green-blue. It has spells you cast with converted mana cost 6 or greater have Cascade, but that part really doesn't matter all that much. Now, I really at first was trying to make a deck around this commander work rather than the first sliver because, well, this is first off a 23-cent card versus the first sliver is a $14 card. And obviously also with this being a 2-color commander, it's just easier to cast. Also, the fact that the first sliver can be a very threatening commander in a lot of pods, and a Moti, well, might not seem all that threatening, and can probably get away with something like this a little bit easier. Regardless, obviously, since a Moti doesn't have red, you don't have access to Tybalt's Trickery, which is unfortunate. That being said, you do have access to Polymorph, which can work with some workarounds. Polymorph says destroy target creature can't be regenerated. Its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. That player puts that card onto the battlefield and shuffles all their cards revealed this way into their library. Now again, unfortunately, the way that Cascade works, you are actually going to have to resolve this before your commander resolves, so you can't target your commander with this. That being said, of course, there are ways to actually get creature tokens into play, you know, with lands, with things like Colony Garden, or, you know, a way to have a land turn into a creature like Mishra's Factory. With this build, you also could use Karuga the Macro Sage as your companion and get your companion out first, and then actually cast Polymorph on this. Again, there are workarounds to actually make this work. So again, when you polymorph, then you'd be polymorphing into your Blightsteel Colossus, and everyone has a good time. Okay, well, mostly you were having a good time. Now, one other option that might work with this instead of Polymorph might be Proteus Staff, because it's just basically a Polymorph on a stick. Pay 2 and a blue, tap, put target creature on the bottom of its owner's library. That creature's controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. They put that card into play in the rest of the bottom of the library in any order. Play this ability only anytime you can play a sorcery. So you could Cascade with a Moti, and then next turn untap and activate this, and then you get your Blightsteel Colossus. Or if you wait till you have enough mana to do both on the same turn, you can do that. Regardless, unfortunately, a build around a Moti just isn't quite as clean as one around the first sliver, so I went with that one. But again, with this episode being 97 lands, let's quickly go through what those 97 lands are for that first sliver deck. First up, obviously, Command Tower, Unclaimed Territory, and Exotic Orchard can be fantastic in this deck, being able to tap for 1 mana of any of our colors, or again with Exotic Orchard, most of the time being able to. And again, since we only need to actually cast the first sliver once, we've got some lands like Aether Hub, Crumbling Vestige, and Archaeological Dig, which can just give us 1 mana of any color once. Next up, some slightly slower lands that can give us 1 mana of any color. We've got Path of Ancestry in Mirrodin's Core. Path of Ancestry is going to come into play tapped in Mirrodin's Core. We actually have to tap to get a charge counter on it at first, but again, if we've got time to build these up, we can. And speaking of slightly slower, but any color, we of course have Vivid Marsh, Vivid Meadow, Vivid Grove, Vivid Creek, and Vivid Crag. Yes, the Vivid lands which enter the battlefield, tap with 2 charge counters on them, and we can tap to remove a charge counter from them to add 1 mana of any color. And we also have some lands like Rupture Spire, Transguild Promenade, and Archway Commons that enter the battlefield tapped, and we actually have to pay 1 to make sure we don't sacrifice them, but after we do that, they can tap for 1 mana of any color. And speaking of sacrificing, we've got some lands that do come into play tapped and only tap for 1 color, or we can tap and sacrifice them to add 1 mana of any color. And those cards are Seafloor Debris, Bog Wreckage, Timberland Ruins, Ravaged Highlands, and Abandoned Outpost. Moving on, we do have some filter lands that we can pay 1 and tap for 1 mana of any color with cards like Painted Bluffs, Guild Mage's Forum, Cave of Temptation, Study Hall, Unknown Shores, Opal Palace, Hall of Oracles, and Shimmering Grotto. Next up, we've got our tri-lands, or at least the budget tri-lands that we have access to that are each under $1 with Opulent Palace, Crumbling Necropolis, Nomad Outpost, Frontier Bivouac, Mystic Monastery, Arcane Sanctum, Jungle Shrine, and Stampede Citadel. I totally said that last one wrong. Sand Step Citadel. There we go. Anyways, these tri-lands come to play tapped and tap for 1 mana of 3 colors. Next up, we also have some lands that can search for other lands to get them into play with things like Mirrored Landscape, Evolving Wilds, Terminal Moraine, Terramorphic Expanse, Warp Landscape, and Blighted Woodland. And moving on, we've got some lands that can also search, but they're a little more specific on what they can go get with cards like Rocky Tar Pit, Floodplain, Grasslands, Vant Panorama, Esper Panorama, Naya Panorama, and Crows and Verge. And actually, Crows and Verge is a way for us to ramp and get specific lands, and it's going to go get a Forest and a Plain, so in the right circumstance, we can actually get our commander out on turn 4 with this. And when I say get our commander out, I mean cast it, because again, our commander is going to be going away thanks to Trickery. But moving on, we've got an incredibly spicy land with this deck with Littjara Mirror Lake. It enters the battlefield, tap, and it can tap to add a blue, but most importantly, it has pay 2 green in a blue, tap and sacrifice it. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it enters the battlefield with additional +1 counter on it, activates ability only anytime you cast a sorcery. You know what's better than 1 Blightsteel Colossus? 2 Blightsteel Colossuses. Colossi. Whatever they're called. Regardless, we also can have somewhat of a backup plan if we really want with Maze's End. And actually, okay, I will mention that this card did break the, $1 budget for all lands, but I made one exception, okay? Regardless, Maze's End is going to enter the battlefield tapped and tap for a color, so we can pay 3 and tap to return it to its owner's hand. Then we can search our library for a gate card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle our library. If we control 10 or more gates with different names, we win the game. So of course, we're also going to be including all the guild gates, 1 for each guild, and then Gateway Plaza as well. And finally, of course, to round things out, we've got a mixture of basic lands with swamps, forests, plains, islands, and mountains. And now that we've gone through every single non-land card in this deck, and then some, let's talk about the price. So that 97 land Blightsteel Colossus deck, which was the first version that we talked about, is again decently expensive for a, let's again call it a budget deck because of the budget restrictions at $85.51. Now, do keep in mind that this estimated cost does include the cost of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, so if you already have those, great, there's some extra savings there. And speaking of extra savings, you might be able to save even more if you buy this deck on TCG Player and utilize heavily played and damage cards because again, those cards always need a home too. That being said, this estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. Now, with all that said, again, with this estimated cost, again, like I mentioned earlier, Blightsteel Colossus is like $41 or so out of that entire cost. So if you actually want to switch it to a different kind of build, again, like that Eternal Dominion build where you take Blightsteel Colossus out and replace it with, like a card that's less than $1, it goes all the way down to $43, which is much more affordable. And since the commander makes up like $14 of this deck, yeah, the rest of the deck is pretty budget friendly. Also, keep in mind though that with this build, again, you cannot use Gigantha because again, Eternal Dominion does not meet that requirement, so please keep that in mind. Regardless, I would love to hear your thoughts on this 97 lands deck and the variations on it, and the emote concept as well. This deck is pretty off the wall, but I very much enjoyed putting it together, and yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts. So as always, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. I really do appreciate hearing from you, and of course, as always, thanks again, and have a good one.